The wind spoke first. It was a dry, rasping language, older than the bone-white sun that bleached the plains. It told stories of dust and endings, of things left behind. Silas understood this language better than he understood the words of men. He rode with his head down, the brim of his hat a low horizon against the glare. His horse, a steady bay named Anchor, picked its way through the sagebrush, its hooves making soft, rhythmic thuds against the hard-packed earth. This was his penance and his peace. The endless sky, the indifferent land, the silence that pressed in on him until it felt like a physical weight. He was checking a line of crumbling fence posts, a task that needed no thought, only motion. It was in this emptiness that he heard it, a sound that did not belong. Not the cry of a hawk or the complaint of a coyote. It was smaller, sharper, a fractured note in the grand, empty symphony. He reined Anchor to a halt, his hand resting on the worn leather of his saddle horn. He listened. The wind carried it again. A whimper. Human. His body went rigid. Company was a danger. A stranger was a threat. His first instinct, honed by years of solitude in a past he never spoke of, was to turn Anchor around and ride back to the shelter of his cabin, to bolt the door and pretend the world contained only him. But the sound came again, thin and desperate, snagging on the thorns of his conscience. He nudged the horse forward, moving toward a small, gnarled clutch of cottonwoods huddled by a dry creek bed. The air grew still, as if the land itself were holding its breath, and then he saw it. A flash of color against the gray-brown bark. Not a bird, not a flower, a child. A girl, no older than 7 or 8 winters, her dark hair a tangled mess against her cheek. She was bound to the trunk of the thickest cottonwood, her wrists and ankles tied with coarse rope that had bitten deep into her skin. Her deerskin dress was torn, her face smudged with dirt and tears that had long since dried. She was a native child. Her eyes, wide and dark as a forest at midnight, were fixed on him. They held no plea, only a terrible, ancient stillness. A deep, knowing fear that had aged her beyond her years. The world stopped. The wind died. The sun seemed to hang motionless in the sky. Silas slid from his saddle, his movements slow, deliberate. He saw the frayed ends of the rope, the crude, tight knots. This was not the work of her own people. This was a different kind of cruelty. A casual, brutal message left for the buzzards and the sun. He felt a cold rage rise in his chest, a feeling he thought he had buried long ago. He took a step closer, and the girl flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. He stopped. He held up his empty hands, palms forward, a gesture of peace, a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. Slowly, he reached for the knife at his belt. The steel whispered as it left the sheath. The girl's eyes darted to the blade, and for the first time, a flicker of terror broke through her hardened calm. He knelt, not looking at her, but at the ropes, one clean upward slice. The rope at her ankles fell away. He moved to her wrists, his calloused fingers brushing against her skin. The bindings were tighter here, swollen with her struggle. He had to work the blade carefully, sawing through the fibers one by one. She did not make a sound. She did not even breathe. When the last strand parted, she slumped against the tree, her freed hands falling limp in her lap. Silas stood, backing away, giving her space. He sheathed his knife and waited. The girl did not move. She simply sat at the base of the tree, a small, broken thing in a vast, uncaring world. And in her silence, Silas heard the echo of a promise he had once made to another child in another life, a promise he had failed to keep. This time, he would not fail. He would not ride away. He brought her back to the cabin. She did not walk. She allowed herself to be lifted onto his saddle, a weightless bundle of old fears. He walked beside Anchor, one hand on the reins, the other resting near her small foot, a silent assurance. The cabin was more a hovel than a home, built of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and determination. It stood alone, a single tooth against the sweeping jaw of the plains. Inside, it was dark and smelled of wood smoke, leather, and loneliness. He set her down on the single cot, a crude frame strung with rope and covered with a thick wool blanket. She immediately curled into herself, pulling her knees to her chest, making herself as small as possible. Her eyes followed his every move, two dark, wary moons in the dim light. Silas moved with a quiet purpose that bordered on ritual. He stoked the embers in the stone fireplace, coaxing a small flame to life. The firelight danced across the log walls, pushing back the shadows. He filled a tin cup with water from the bucket and placed it on the small crate that served as a table beside the cot. He did not urge her to drink. He simply left it there, an offering. He then turned his attention to her wounds. He heated water in a small pot over the fire, tore a strip from a clean flour sack, and found the small tin of salve his mother had taught him to make from pine resin and beeswax. It was a remedy for saddle sores and cracked hands, but it would have to do. He approached the cot slowly, as one might approach a trapped wolf. He knelt again. He held out the damp cloth. She stared at it, then at him. Her gaze was unnerving, a silent cross-examination of his soul. He didn't speak. Words were clumsy tools, and he had forgotten how to use them with any grace. Instead, he made his movements a language. He dabbed the cloth gently at the raw, chafed skin of her wrists. She flinched but did not pull away. He worked with a tenderness that felt foreign in his own hands, his rough fingers cleaning away the dirt, revealing the angry red welts beneath. He applied the salve, its pine scent filling the small space between them. It was an intimate act, a trespass on her pain, and he felt the weight of it in his own chest. He did the same for her ankles. When he was done, he backed away, returning to the other side of the cabin, creating a chasm of space between them. He gave her the entire room, retreating to the shadows near the hearth as if he were the intruder. He busied himself with tasks that didn't need doing, checking the latch on the door, rearranging the firewood, his movements a buffer against the suffocating silence. The girl did not move from the cot. She did not drink the water. She simply watched. Her stillness was a presence, a force. It filled the cabin, seeping into the cracks in the walls, mingling with the smoke from the fire. For Silas, the silence was different now. It was no longer the empty silence of solitude. It was a shared silence, taut with fear and uncertainty. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a frozen lake, the ice thin and treacherous beneath his feet. One wrong move, one loud noise, and it would all shatter. As dusk settled, painting the single window in hues of bruised purple and orange, he cooked. He sliced bacon into an iron skillet, the sizzle and pop loud in the quiet room. He baked a potato in the coals of the fire. The smell of food, of sustenance, was a simple, honest thing. He put a plate on the crate next to the water, the steam rising in a soft plume. Then he took his own plate and sat on the floor by the door, his back to the wall, eating in the near dark. He was a sentinel at the gates of her fear. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun. The girl remained a silent fixture on the cot, a statue carved from wariness. Silas moved around her, a slow, orbiting planet. He established a rhythm, a routine that she could learn, predict. He would rise before dawn, stoke the fire, and leave a piece of johnny cake and a cup of watered-down milk on the crate. He would tend to his horse, mend his gear, work on the endless list of chores that kept a man from thinking too much. He never tried to speak to her, He never demanded a name or a story. He understood that her silence was her only armor, and he would not try to strip it from her. He offered her not comfort, but consistency. He was the sun that rose, the fire that burned, the door that remained closed against the world. He was a fact, immutable, predictable. Slowly, tentatively, the ice began to thaw. On the third morning, he returned from the stable to find the cup of milk empty. The Johnny cake was untouched, but the milk was gone. It was a victory so small, it was almost invisible, yet it resonated in the quiet cabin like a shout. The next day, half the cake was gone. A day later, the plate was clean. She ate only when he was not looking. In the liminal moments when he was outside, his presence reduced to the sound of an axe splitting wood or the soft nickering of his horse. He began to leave small things on the crate for her. A smooth, river-washed stone, a hawk's feather he found near the creek. One afternoon, while sitting on the porch, he took a small block of pine and his knife and began to carve. His hands, usually so rough and capable only of brute tasks, moved with a surprising delicacy. The wood curled away in thin ribbons, and slowly, a shape emerged. It was a small bird, a sparrow, its head cocked, its form simple but alive. He worked on it for hours, losing himself in the feel of the wood, the focus of the blade. When it was done, he sanded it smooth with a piece of worn leather until it felt warm and sleek in his palm. That evening, he placed the wooden sparrow on the crate beside her food. He expected nothing. It was a gesture made for himself as much as for her. But when he glanced over from his position by the fire, he saw her small hand creep out from under the blanket. Her fingers brushed against the bird, then retreated. A moment later, they emerged again, bolder this time. She picked it up. She held it in her palm, her thumb tracing the curve of its back. She did not look at him. Her world was focused entirely on the small piece of wood in her hand. For the first time since he'd found her, she was not just a bundle of fear. She was a child holding a toy. Silas felt something shift inside him, a tectonic plate of grief and regret moving just slightly. He remembered carving a similar bird for his own daughter a lifetime ago. A little girl with hair the color of corn silk and a laugh that could shame the sun. The memory was a dull ache, a phantom limb he had learned to ignore. But now, watching this silent, dark-haired child hold the sparrow, the ache sharpened into a clear, cutting pain. He looked away, turning his face to the fire, his jaw tight. The firelight flickered, casting his shadow, long and stooped, against the wall. The cabin was quiet again, but this time, the silence held a new shape. It was the shape of a shared secret, a fragile connection forged in wood and memory. The sky had been a flat, metallic gray for 2 days, the air thick and heavy with unspoken promises of violence. On the 4th night, the storm broke. It did not arrive with a gentle warning of distant thunder. It fell upon the small cabin with the sudden fury of an ambush. A crack of lightning split the heavens, and the world outside the window went white for a searing, instantaneous moment. The thunder that followed was not a rumble, but a physical blow, a deafening explosion that shook the log walls and rattled the tin cup on the crate. The rain came in a solid, wind-driven sheet, hammering against the roof, clawing at the door. Inside the cabin, the fire in the hearth seemed to shrink, its light small and fragile against the elemental chaos. Silas, sitting by the hearth, felt the storm in his bones. It was a mirror to the turmoil he had carried for years, the tempest of what-ifs and regrets that raged within him. He was accustomed to this kind of weather, both inside and out, but then he heard a sound. A small gasp from the cot. He turned. In the flickering firelight, he saw the girl. She was sitting bolt upright, the blanket clutched to her chin. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the single dark window, where the lightning flashed again and again. Each explosion of thunder made her flinch, her small body trembling. She was not a silent statue anymore. The storm had broken through her defenses, exposing the terrified child beneath. Another crash of thunder, closer this time, sounded as if a giant were splitting the very earth apart. A whimper escaped her lips, small and lost in the howl of the wind. Silas stood. He walked to the window and pulled the rough burlap sack he used as a curtain across it, plunging the room into the warmer, more intimate world of the firelight. He blocked out the terrifying, strobing light of the storm, but he could not block out the sound. He turned back to the girl. Her fear was a palpable thing in the small room. He thought of what to do. Words were useless. Touch felt like a violation. He was a stranger, a big, rough man who smelled of horses and wood smoke. He was a part of the frightening, unpredictable world that had hurt her. He walked back to the fireplace and picked up a log, placing it carefully on the embers. Sparks flew up the chimney like a flurry of angry fireflies. He stared into the flames, his mind reaching for a solution, for some gesture that would not be misinterpreted. He thought of songs his mother used to sing, but his voice was a low growl, more likely to frighten than soothe. Then he remembered something else. He reached for the battered leather satchel where he kept his few meaningful possessions. From it, he pulled a small, tarnished silver locket. He walked to the cot and knelt, not too close, but near enough. He didn't offer the locket to her. He just opened it in his own palm. The firelight glinted off the two small, faded portraits inside. A woman with a gentle smile, and a little girl with bright, laughing eyes. His wife, his daughter. He didn't say their names. He didn't explain. He just held the locket open, a silent confession, a sharing of his own storm. The girl's terrified gaze shifted from the curtained window to the locket in his hand. She looked at the tiny faces, then up at his own weathered, grief-stricken face. The thunder cracked again, but this time she barely flinched. Her eyes were locked on his. In that moment, something passed between them, an understanding deeper than language. She saw his ghosts, and he saw hers. She was not alone in her fear. He was not alone in his loss. He closed the locket with a soft click and put it away. He sat on the floor, his back against the wall, a few feet from her cot. He did not speak. He did not move. He just sat, a quiet, steady presence in the heart of the storm, a silent promise that he would not let the world break in. The morning after the storm was a baptism. The air, washed clean of dust and doubt, smelled of wet earth and pine. A fragile, crystalline light filtered through the single window, painting the cabin in soft, hopeful strokes. The world was quiet, reborn. The silence was no longer heavy or tense. It was calm, contemplative. Silas rose and went about his morning ritual, but he moved with a new lightness. The shared vulnerability of the storm had changed the atmosphere between them. The invisible wall of fear had been breached. He placed the usual breakfast on the crate, but this time he did not immediately retreat. He stood by the hearth, watching the small flames lick at the new logs. He felt her eyes on him, but the gaze was different. The wariness was still there, but it was blunted, softened by a sliver of something else. Curiosity, maybe even trust. He heard a soft rustle of movement behind him. He did not turn, he waited. A small shadow fell on the floor beside him. He looked down. The girl was standing there, a few feet away, holding the small carved sparrow in her outstretched hand. She was offering it back to him. It was the first voluntary movement she had made toward him, the first gesture that was not a reaction to fear. It was an action, a sentence in a language of symbols. He looked from the bird to her face. For the first time, he saw her not as a symbol of suffering or a reminder of his own loss, but simply as a child. Her dark eyes, clear and deep, held a question. He slowly knelt, his knees cracking in protest. He did not take the bird. He gently closed her small fingers around it and pushed her hand back toward her own chest. "It's yours," he said. His voice was rough, a rusted hinge unused for years. It sounded loud and alien in the quiet room. The girl blinked, surprised by the sound of his voice, but not frightened. She clutched the bird to her chest, her gaze unwavering. She held his eyes for a long moment, and in that shared glance, a silent pact was sealed. The terror had receded, leaving behind a fragile foundation on which something new could be built. She turned and walked back to the cot, not with the scuttling fear of a mouse, but with a quiet dignity. She sat and began to eat her breakfast in the open while he was still in the room. This simple act of normalcy was more profound than any spoken words of gratitude. Silas felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling so unfamiliar he almost didn't recognize it. It was a brittle, fragile thing. This peace. He knew it. The world that had tied her to a tree was still out there, just beyond the door. The men who had done it were still out there. His quiet, ordered solitude had been shattered, and there was no going back. He had taken on a responsibility he never sought, and he did not know where it would lead. But as he watched the child eat, the small wooden bird resting on the blanket beside her, he knew he did not regret it. The emptiness inside him, the vast, echoing space left by his past, felt a little smaller this morning. The quiet of the cabin was no longer the quiet of loneliness. It was the quiet of sanctuary. He walked to the door and opened it, letting the clean morning light flood the room. He breathed it in. It was the calm before something else. He could feel it. The land was too still, the sky too clear. It was the deep breath the world takes before it screams. The scream began not as a sound, but as a feeling, a low, persistent tremor in the soles of his boots. Silas was splitting firewood, the rhythmic thud of his axe a familiar comfort. He stopped mid-swing, his head cocked. The vibration was faint at first, a deep thrumming that seemed to come from the earth itself. It was not the rumble of distant thunder. This was different. This was alive. He set the axe down and walked to the edge of the small rise where his cabin stood, his eyes scanning the vast, empty horizon. Anchor, his horse, whinnied nervously from the lean-to, stamping a hoof. The tremor grew stronger, a steady, rhythmic pulse that he could now feel in his chest. It was the sound of hoofbeats. Not one horse, not a dozen, hundreds. He squinted, his hand shielding his eyes from the morning sun. At first, they were a dark smudge against the endless blue of the sky, a disturbance on the clean line of the horizon. Then the smudge resolved itself into shapes, then into figures, riders. A wave of them, stretching from one end of the plains to the other. A dark, flowing river of men and horses, moving with a single, unified purpose. They were coming for him. The blood drained from his face. His first thought was of the men who had tied the girl to the tree. Had they come back to finish the job? Were they a posse, come to punish him for interfering? But as they drew closer, he saw the flash of feathers, the glint of painted skin, the long, dark braids of warriors. They were not settlers. He felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He had heard stories. Entire homesteads burned to the ground, families wiped out for a perceived slight. He had stumbled into a war he wanted no part of. His hand instinctively went to the pistol at his hip, the weight of it, a cold, hard reality. He could run inside, bar the door. He had a rifle, ammunition. He could make a stand. It would be a short one. Futile. He turned and looked at the cabin door. Behind it was the girl. He understood. They were not here for him. They were here for her. He imagined the scene. A lone man, a rifle, a native child in his cabin. There was no way to explain, no language for it. His good deed had become his death warrant. He stood frozen for a long second, caught between the instinct to fight and the certainty of annihilation. Then he looked at his own hands, calloused, scarred, but clean. He had done the right thing. He had not wavered when he found her, and he would not waver now. He took a deep breath, the clean morning air feeling like a final gift. He unbuckled his gun belt and let it drop to the dust with a soft thud. He would not meet them with violence. He would meet them as he was, a man, unarmed, standing before his home. He turned back to face the approaching tide. The sound was a roar now, the thunder of 1,000 hooves shaking the very foundations of his world. He could see their faces, hard and impassive, their eyes fixed on his small, solitary cabin. They were a force of nature, an avalanche of righteous fury, and he was a single, fragile tree in their path. He saw the girl appear in the doorway of the cabin behind him. Her eyes were not on him, but on the riders, and in her face he saw not terror, but something else. Recognition, a dawning, unbelievable light. The world held its breath. The thundering hoofbeats ceased. The silence that fell was more deafening than the noise it replaced. They surrounded the cabin, a silent, formidable ring of 300 warriors. They sat astride their horses, a forest of lances and feathers against the stark blue sky. Their faces were masks of stone, their eyes holding the weight of generations of grief and fury. They did not move. They did not speak. They simply watched, their collective gaze a physical pressure on the small cabin, on the lone man who stood before it. Silas stood on his porch, his feet planted firmly on the weathered planks. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, but his hands were steady at his sides. He had shed his fear along with his weapon. What remained was a stark, quiet resolve. He was no longer a man running from his past. He was a man standing his ground for the present. He met their stares, without aggression, without defiance. His own gaze was level, open. He had nothing to hide. His story was written in his actions, in the unarmed man he presented to them. He was a shield, his body positioned between the warriors and the cabin door, where the girl stood half hidden in the shadows. He was not protecting her from them. He was protecting her return. From the center of the formidable line, one rider moved forward. He was older than the others, his face a roadmap of seasons and sorrows. A single eagle feather was braided into his long gray hair. He rode with an authority that needed no announcement. The chief. He reined his horse to a halt a dozen yards from the porch. The horse, a magnificent black war pony, snorted, its breath pluming in the cool air. The silence stretched, thin and taut as a bowstring. Every eye was on the chief, on Silas. It was a negotiation without words, a trial by stillness. The chief's eyes, dark and piercing, swept over Silas, taking in his unarmed stance, his unadorned work clothes, his steady gaze. He looked at the cabin, a silent question hanging in the air. Silas gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He did not step aside. He did not gesture. He waited. He understood this was not his moment. He had played his part. The next move belonged to the girl. He held his ground, a silent guardian of a fragile peace, his presence a testament to the choice he had made at the cottonwood tree. He had chosen humanity over fear, and he would see that choice through to its end, whatever that end might be. The air crackled with unspoken history, with the ghosts of 1,000 broken treaties and violent encounters. This moment could pivot on a single misunderstanding, a single twitch of a hand. Silas stood as still as the plains themselves, a small, solitary island of calm in a sea of potential violence, and waited for the tide to turn. The chief dismounted, his movements fluid and dignified. He handed the reins of his horse to a younger warrior and began to walk toward the cabin. He did not look at Silas. His eyes were fixed on the shadows of the doorway. He stopped at the foot of the 3 wooden steps that led to the porch, his gaze patient, questioning. From the darkness of the cabin, the girl emerged. She stepped out of the shadow and into the full light of the sun, her small form silhouetted against the dark interior. She was no longer the broken, terrified creature from the creek bed. She stood straight, her head held high. In her hand, she clutched the small carved sparrow. She took a tentative step forward, her eyes locked on the chief. A single word escaped her lips, soft as a breath of wind, but it carried across the silent yard. Ata, father. The chief's stoic expression fractured. A flicker of profound relief, of deep, aching love, softened the hard lines of his face. He took a step up, his hand outstretched. The girl walked across the porch, her small feet making no sound on the wooden planks. She walked past Silas, so close her deerskin dress brushed against his leg. It was a fleeting touch, a ghost of a connection, but in it, he felt the full weight of her journey from fear to freedom. She did not hesitate. She walked directly to her father and into his arms. The chief knelt and enveloped her in a hug that was fierce and tender, a lifetime of fear and searching pouring out in that single, silent embrace. He buried his face in her hair, his broad shoulders trembling. The stone-faced warriors watched, their impassive masks cracking to reveal the men beneath. A collective sigh seemed to pass through them, a release of tension that was almost audible. Silas watched, an outsider looking in on a sacred reunion. He felt a pang of something he could not name, a bittersweet ache of joy for them, mingled with the hollow echo of his own losses. He had been a temporary harbor in her storm, but now her ship had come in. He was once again alone on the shore. He turned to go back inside, to leave them to their moment, to retreat to the solitude that was his home. But the girl, still held in her father's arms, turned her head. Her dark eyes found his. She held up her hand, opening her small fist. The wooden sparrow lay in her palm. She looked at him, then at her father, then back to him. A silent, eloquent story. This man. This is what he gave me. The chief followed her gaze. He looked at the small bird, then he raised his eyes to meet Silas's. For the first time, he truly saw him. Not as a white man, not as a threat or a potential enemy, but as the man who had sheltered his daughter, the man who had carved a piece of hope from a block of wood. He saw the salve on her wrists. He saw the lack of fear in her eyes. He saw the truth. The chief slowly rose to his full height, his daughter's hand held firmly in his. He looked at Silas, his eyes holding a depth of understanding that transcended any need for language. He saw the loneliness that clung to Silas like a second skin, the quiet grief etched into the lines around his eyes. He saw the ghosts Silas carried, and Silas, in turn, saw the immense burden of leadership in the chief's gaze, the weary strength of a man trying to hold his world together against a tide of violence and loss. In that silent exchange, 2 old soldiers from 2 different wars recognized each other. The chief turned to the young warrior who held his horse. He spoke a few quiet words in his own tongue. The warrior nodded and reached into a pouch on his saddle. He drew something out and handed it to the chief. It was a single, perfect eagle feather. The quill was wrapped in red trade cloth and decorated with intricate beadwork. It was a thing of immense power and significance, a symbol of the highest honor. The chief walked up the 3 steps onto the porch. He stopped directly in front of Silas. The air was charged, the moment sacred. The 300 warriors watched in absolute silence. He held out the feather. "You did not take her," the chief said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. "You gave her shelter." Silas could only nod, his throat tight. "She was lost," he managed, the words feeling small and inadequate. The chief's eyes softened. "The world is full of men who would see a lost child and only see an opportunity for cruelty," he said, his gaze sweeping over the raw marks on his daughter's wrists, which were now healing. "You saw only a child." He pressed the eagle feather into Silas's hand. The touch was light, but the weight of the gesture was immense. "This is for a man who stands unarmed when he is outnumbered, for a man who offers kindness when he has reason to fear. Our people will not forget this cabin. The wind will carry your name with respect. You will be safe in this land. This is my promise." The girl stepped forward and gently placed the carved sparrow into Silas's other hand. She looked up at him, and for the first time, a small, shy smile touched her lips. It was a sunrise, a gift more precious than the feather. Silas looked down at the 2 objects in his calloused palms. The feather, a symbol of honor from a world that was not his. The bird, a symbol of a connection he never expected to find. He felt the frozen dam in his chest finally, irrevocably break. A single, hot tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. It was a tear not of sorrow, but of release. The chief placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. He gave Silas one last, long look of understanding, then turned and led the girl down the steps. He mounted his horse, settled his daughter in front of him, and with a single sharp cry, he wheeled the horse around. As one, the river of warriors turned, their horses churning the dust. They flowed back toward the horizon, as silent and swift as they had arrived, leaving behind only the trembling earth and a profound, ringing silence. Silas stood on the porch for a long time, watching until the last rider had disappeared over the horizon. The plains were empty again, the vast, silent stage upon which his small life was set. The sun was high in the sky. The day was just a day again, but everything was different. The silence that returned was not the hollow, lonely silence he had known for years. It was a new kind of quiet, filled with the echo of the morning's events. It was a silence that held respect, a silence that held memory. He looked down at his hands. In one, the eagle feather, its edges impossibly soft, its meaning immeasurably heavy. In the other, the small wooden sparrow, smooth and warm from the girl's grasp. He had given away a piece of his craft, and in return, he had been given a piece of his soul back. He walked back into the cabin. The space felt immense, empty. The cot, with its rumpled blanket, was a stark reminder of the small presence that had filled his home for the past week. The empty cup on the crate, the ghost of her fear in the corner, it was all still there. But the house was not haunted by her absence. It was blessed by it. He carefully placed the eagle feather on the rough-hewn mantelpiece above the fireplace, propping it against the stone. It stood out, a single stroke of grace and honor in the rustic, Spartan room. It changed the character of the space entirely. It was no longer just a shelter from the elements. It was a place where peace had been brokered, where 2 worlds had touched without violence. He held the wooden bird in his palm, his thumb tracing its familiar curves. He thought of his own daughter, of the crushing weight of his failure to protect her. For years, that failure had defined him, had driven him into this self-imposed exile. He had believed he was a coward, a man who had run when he should have stood. But today, he had stood. He had faced down an army with nothing but his own conviction. He hadn't saved the world. He had only saved one child. But in doing so, he had perhaps saved himself. The tight, cold knot of grief in his chest had not vanished, but it had loosened its hold. It no longer felt like a stone, but like a memory he could carry without being crushed by it. He was still alone. He would still wake to the vast, empty plains and the long, silent days. But he was no longer just a man in hiding. He was the man who was safe in the land, the man whose name the wind carried with respect. He had been given a gift, not of property or wealth, but of place. He belonged here now, not just as a trespasser on the land, but as a part of its story. He sat on the edge of the cot, the wooden bird in his hand, and for the first time in a decade, he did not feel like he was running from a ghost. He felt like he was finally standing still, ready to live with them. The sun streamed through the open door, and for Silas, it felt like the first day of a new life. And so, the story of the man in the lonely cabin became a quiet legend, whispered on the wind and carried in the hearts of a people who valued courage and kindness above all else. He was a small point of stillness in a turning, violent world. He never saw the girl again, but he saw signs of her people's promise. A dressed deer left by his door in the deep of winter. A bundle of medicinal herbs on his porch step in the spring. Small, silent acknowledgments that he was not forgotten. He was a neighbor. He learned that a fence could be a boundary, but a good deed could be a bridge. And that sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is not to raise a weapon, but to simply hold out an empty hand. For in the end, our lives are not measured by the battles we win, but by the moments we choose grace over fear. By the small, almost invisible acts of humanity that ripple outward, touching shores we may never see, and changing the world in ways we may never know.